Okay, let's begin our presentation. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar entitled Business Email Compromise, New Vulnerabilities and Best Practices During the Pandemic and Beyond. My name is Tom Anino. I'm the moderator of today's webinar. Just a few items before we get started. A quick recommendation for the audience. We have found that the way to get the best audio quality is to use headphones to listen to the presentation today. We will be taking questions, and you can ask them at any time by typing them into the question section of your GoToWebinar dashboard. Also, we will be recording today's webinar. The recording will be available for download in the perspective section at dgccpa.com. You can also download a PDF of the slide deck there as well. And before we continue, let's meet our panelists for today's presentation, beginning with Nick Delina. Nick is a principal at DGC, and he leads the firm's IT risk assurance and advisory practice, advising clients on overcoming cybersecurity and compliance challenges. Nick and his team at DGC provide third-party independent reporting and certification to satisfy regulators, customers, and prospects, ensuring that organizations are compliant with best practices. Nick was recently elected to the National Defense Industrial Association's New England Chapter Board of Directors. DGC is an accounting and business advisory firm specializing in services for privately held businesses and individuals, including cyber and information security risk, IT consulting, SOC audits, and internal audits. Mike McMorrow is a treasury management officer at TD Bank. Mike consults with clients to better understand how they can leverage their investments in technology, protect their accounts against fraud, and drive efficiencies in their daily treasury operation through automated payables and receivables solutions. TD Bank serves companies of all sizes with a broad suite of small business and commercial banking services, wealth management services, and consumer banking and mortgage lending services through over 1,200 locations from Maine to Florida. And finally, Rob Munnelly is a lawyer and shareholder at Davis Mom with more than 30 years of experience handling legal issues clients face in highly regulated industries, including energy, communications, and the emerging Massachusetts cannabis market. He also has over 10 years of experience representing clients in data security and privacy matters, along with teaching seminars and authoring numerous articles on a range of data security and privacy topics. Davis Mom is a full-service, Boston-based business law firm that represents local, national, and global businesses, institutions, and individuals in a wide spectrum of industries. So before we dive into the content of today's presentation, we want to begin with a quick poll question to get a better sense of our audience today. Really simply, what is the size of your business? GoToWebinar is going to launch a poll that should be on your screen right now. We encourage all of you to vote, and we thank you for your participation in our polls today. There will be more throughout the presentation. Give everyone just a few more seconds here to get in your responses. Thank you to everyone who's voting. And I'm going to close the window in 3, 2, and 1. So as we look at our responses, 59% of responses were 1 to 50 employees, 32% at 51 to 500, and 9% at over 500 employees. So with that, I'll now turn it over to Nick Delina.
Before we get there, Tom, I just wanted to comment. It's great that we have people from all aspects of size in the seminar. One of the things I think you'll learn as we go is that different companies face different challenges, and even the smaller ones can benefit from the types of things that we're learning today.
That's great. Yeah, and thank you, Tom. And just to build off of what Rob said, given that 59% of you are in the smaller business segment, I'm sure you're going to be facing a lot of the challenges we're going to talk about today. And, you're probably facing some of the resource constraints that a lot of your peers are in the industry with, lack of resources and capabilities. So hopefully some of the things we talk about today will give you some pointers, set you in the right direction. And what we're focusing on today will be applicable to your, 1 to 50 smaller business segment, as well as the other segments. So hopefully you find that useful. Okay, so the purpose of today's webinar is to shed some light on one of the most impactful and costly forms of cybercrime, and that is business email compromise. This is a type of scam where an attacker assumes the identity of somebody in your company with the goal of stealing money, usually in the form of wire transfers. The fraudsters usually impersonate somebody on the executive team or in senior management, and two attributes that are commonplace in the attack are urgency and authority. So the CFO needs you to wire $100,000 right now so that a mission critical transaction can take place. And he or she might be traveling or about to step into a meeting and can't take a phone call to further clarify. In some other less common cases, it might not be money that they're after. It might be personally identifiable information, or it might be legal documents or other types of sensitive documents. And these types of attacks are usually timed for the close of a business day or the close of a week or just before a holiday to limit the amount of time you might have to investigate the request. Next slide. And so to understand the scope of the problem that we're looking at, the FBI has estimated that business email compromise has cost organizations over $26 billion worldwide in the last 4 years. 90% of companies surveyed by the company Proofpoint in 2019 had been targeted by BEC attacks. So these types of attacks are very common. And there have been many high-profile attacks, as you can see, some of which we've documented here. And these are not small dollar amount attacks. And even charities like Save the Children have been impacted. And of course, as if 2020 couldn't get any worse, COVID-19 is adding fuel to the fire, with data emerging that BEC attacks have been up at least 200% since March. Next slide.
Great, thank you, Nick. So let's examine the phishing landscape. So why is business email compromise, also known as imposter fraud, so prevalent today? Cyber criminals continue to develop new phishing techniques through multiple targeted attacks, resulting in undetected hacking and monitoring of email communications over extended periods of time. Their tactics also evolve over time to obtain sensitive information, which can result in both identity theft and financial loss. So here are some examples of scams. And while we've probably all heard of business email compromise scams involving compromised supplier invoices resulting in fraudulent wire transfers and ACH payment transactions, other scams can include supplier invoices that are merely intercepted, compromised, and redistributed back into the email chain with only updated remittance mailing addresses and not banking information changes, again, to try to avoid detection. The fraudsters have determined in this case that paper checks are the usual payment method and will use or trade that sensitive account information for further fraudulent activity. Another example as seen here is when the fraudster impersonates the CEO and asks her assistant to purchase dozens of gift cards confidentially for employee rewards and requests she send the card serial numbers so she can mail them out to the employees right away, when all along it's obviously a bogus attempt. Next slide, please. So there have been a number of COVID-19 specific phishing campaigns. Malicious cyber threats have historically used major global news events to exploit victim fear, and this has been no exception. As you can see here in some of the bullet points, we provided a large amount of malicious emails across different economic sectors have been received, and well-known brands have been used to deliver these phishing emails, from the World Health Organization to country-specific health agencies like the CDC, the National Institute for Health, even down to organizations like your own healthcare coverage companies, as well as brand names like CVS. So the key here is to be careful when you see those types of phishing emails coming through with lures or attachment links, again, containing COVID-19 information, which you might think is reasonable to open, but you probably would have taken caution not opening them before COVID-19. Just some examples from a phishing landscape perspective I can share with you that here at TD Bank, over the first 6 months of this year, TD Bank employees reported over 274,000 phishing emails received, with an additional 30,000 reported by our customers. And a noticeable uptick in phishing activity was observed during the COVID period between April and June of this year. Of those, 18,000 emails were classified as malicious, with over 200 impersonating company executives. Of particular note, nearly 9,000 unique phishing sites were detected targeting our customers. These are certainly scary numbers for one institution, and I can only imagine the huge volumes of phishing attempts across the US and global banking industries. Next slide, please.
So as Mike mentioned, COVID-19 has really been a boon to BEC attacks through all the different possible contexts and subject matter to use in these attacks. And the fraudsters are really ripping COVID headlines from the news and using it in these attacks. And this example on the screen here shows an email, purportedly from an organization's human resources team that is offering to fast track a stimulus check, and that they have some mechanism to do that more quickly. And if you click on this form, you'll be brought to a place where you can enter your credentials and off you go. And that'll help you get your stimulus check more quickly to direct deposit. Now, obviously, this is just an attempt to get your credentials to be used in a BEC attack or something else. But this is just an example of how these folks are preying on, our heightened concern over coronavirus, maybe economic concerns around the stimulus checks, but they're using it to, to further their goals. Next slide, please. And here are another couple examples, and these emails have been anonymized, but this is similar to what we're seeing where, in the top example, somebody is purportedly looking to change their direct deposit information with new account details. But this is clearly an attempt by a hacker to intercept a direct deposit check and redirect it to their own bank account. And in the bottom example, this is an attempt to set up a wire purportedly for COVID-19 medical support. And they're going to forward the beneficiary details over, which clearly is going to be, to their own bank accounts. Next slide, please.
Okay, so now it's time for our next polling question. What phishing training do you use? I'll launch the poll right now. And again, we thank you so much for your participation with our polls today. I encourage everyone to use their GoToWebinar dashboard there to put in their votes. Results coming in. We appreciate everyone taking the time to do this. Okay, and I'm going to close the poll in 3, 2, and 1. So the overwhelming number, 56% responded with none, 28% with simulated phishing attacks, and 32% with classroom training.
Great, thanks, Nick, and thanks everyone for responding to that poll. I'd like to say that this is consistent with what we normally see with AFP surveys, including the less than 30% of companies that send periodic fake phishing emails to their employees to test their adherence to company policy. So I guess the question is, does your company test you? And obviously, if they're not doing enough of that, do they plan to? Also, just a fun fact, did you know that over 90% of ransomware comes in through a phishing email? I didn't know that. Next slide, please.
Yeah, actually, can I just add in on that one, Mike and Tom, which is that the classroom score there is a little bit disappointing. You really should be training your employees on common phishing techniques so that they can be alert to it. I understand that the fake phishing emails are one that usually requires a cultural shift, because some people are going to have to realize that if they click on the wrong link, they're going to have to be a little bit embarrassed. But it's certainly another thing that people should be considering.
Great, thank you, Rob. The never-ending fraud discussion. It seems year after year, we find ourselves talking about payments fraud and its evolution from check and wire and ACH, credit cards, to identity theft, phishing attempts, business email compromise, malware, and ransomware, to name a few. And unfortunately, it's become the never-ending discussion. Feedback from our customers. We regularly survey our clients with a joint venture with Strategic Treasurer. And I think the bottom line here is that CFOs and finance teams are overworked and understaffed, with COVID-19 adding additional challenges through layoffs, furloughs, and employees working remotely. As you can see here, in the survey, most of our business customers, again, look at business priorities as growing or expanding into new markets, and also looking at serious investment in technology and innovation. But as you can also see, the level and the response from our practitioners, that more than half still list manual processes as a top operational challenge, and that the payment management is one of the most time-consuming functions to perform. And then a little more than a third of treasury groups admit they don't have time to perform all their responsibilities. So what does it mean? Well, as you can see, managing payments is still very much a manual process, which takes a lot of time that AP teams typically don't have. And while fraud prevention is important, it's not necessarily a priority, and risk management and attention to detail regarding phishing attempts and business email compromise can tend to fall to the wayside. And according to the latest 2020 Strategic Treasurer Survey just released, 82% of companies recognize that the accounts payable area is most susceptible to fraud attempts. However, given the business environment we find ourselves in, everyone needs to be a risk manager, and it shouldn't only fall on the AP team to be vigilant in their defenses. So payments fraud, they're still on the rise. We've seen a dramatic increase in payments fraud and activity over the last 5 years, where you can actually, it does indicate there was a slight downtick from 2019 versus 2018. But I think it's our expectation that these numbers will remain consistent, if not increase a little bit, due to COVID situation and forcing a lot of workers to work remotely and the inherent risk that that poses. Part of this survey also did reinforce that 70% of the organizations responded still listed as checks, and check fraud is the largest single attempt and or loss, with wires coming in second at 40%, and ACH, whether it's debit at 33% and or credits at 22%. Next slide, please.
Okay, it's time now for our third poll question. And again, we really appreciate everyone responding. It's great for us to be able to kind of talk a little bit more specifically based on your audience responses, try to answer more and more of your questions that you might have. Have you experienced a business email compromise attack in the last 6 months? This is a simple yes or no poll that's on your screen right now. We encourage everyone to please respond. Okay, results are coming in. We'll take a few more seconds to give everyone a chance to respond. Okay, and I'm going to close the poll in 3, 2, and 1. And how about this, panel? 50% yes, 50% no.
Wow.
It's rigged.
I think we're seeing a pattern emerging here with 59% of folks in smaller businesses, 56% not doing any phishing training, and about 50% having experienced BEC attacks. So pretty consistent with what I would expect, but there's a pattern, I think, here. Okay, so the next segment we're going to talk about is the technical side of how a BEC attack happens. So we talked about what it is and what we're seeing in the sort of in the marketplace. We're going to talk about how it takes place technically. Next slide, please. So generally, there are 2 ways that a BEC attack will be initiated. One is called a spoof or an impersonation attack, and the other is a compromise or a hack. Spoofing is simply just a way to look like it's coming from your organization when it actually isn't. And as an example here, so we at DJC, we're at djccpa.com, but if you were to buy djccpa.co, you could try to impersonate DJC staff by sending email using the same account, same name, and so on. And that's called a spoof attack. That works in some cases, but a more sophisticated method, of course, is if the hacker actually compromises the account of the person that he or she wants to impersonate. And so there's really those 2 methods of initiating the attack. Next slide. Here's a graphic that I like from our partners at KnowBe4 that describes the attack from end to end. And the start, as I just mentioned, the start can either be through a spoofing attack or an impersonation attack or a compromise. Once they've attempted to do that, they've either taken hold or spoofed the account. They're going to send an email. The second step is the phish. So they're going to send an email to the target, most likely folks in your accounts payable team, with that, whatever the request might be. Maybe it's a urgent wire transfer request, $100,000 to a particular account or what have you. The third step is when the target responds. So they don't have time maybe, or the email conveyed some sense of urgency, but they take action, and for whatever reason, they don't validate the request, or they can't get in touch with the person to confirm that it is an actual request. So they take action, they wire the money, or they send the documentation, or whatever the particulars are. The fourth step is, of course, when the damage is done, when the money's wired out, or the PII is breached, or the sensitive information of any kind is sent out. That's where the damage takes place. And the last step, of course, is the result. Now, the potential fallout from an event like this could be anything, right? It depends on dollar amount that's gone. Maybe if you're a publicly traded company or you're in a regulated industry, you have certain requirements. Of course, from a legal perspective, Rob will speak to this later, there are obligations and requirements, but the consequences can be quite severe. In most cases, most of that money is gone forever. You're not able to get it back. And depending on the number of records, maybe in the data breach or the dollar amount, you might see executives lose their jobs, and certainly there'll be reputational damage. So the consequences can be quite severe. Next slide. So I spoke about the two primary methods of initiating the attack. In this example, this is an attempt to spoof. So this is an email that we're receiving, and it looks like it's from the founder and CEO of a company called Techlicious. And that's his name, his picture, it looks legitimate. But if we click on, and this is just a screenshot from Gmail, there's the 3-button menu and then show original. And this will bring us to email headers. Now, headers, basically consider those like FedEx tracking info for your email. It provides information on the originating mail server and the receiving mail server. So Tom, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So once we click on that show original, now we see the email headers. And yes, there is a lot of what looks like sort of gibberish here, but this is the tracking info basically of the email. And if we go down to the red arrows, you'll see the email didn't originate from Techlicious, which, as we could find out, is an American company and easily sort of traced for where it is. But we see here that the email actually originated from a .cz domain, which is the Czech Republic. And so that obviously doesn't line up. It's a little suspicious. The second arrow that's pointing down shows what's called an SPF soft fail. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about SPF a little later on. I'll come back to that. But this is a protection that the sending organization has in place to help receiving organizations validate email that comes in. So that indicates that this email isn't what it seems. And so I bring this up because if you're receiving an email that's a little out of context, notify your IT folks and they'll dig into this. They'll look at the mail headers and check for things like this that might indicate that the email didn't come from who we think it came from or who they're purporting to be. So that's one way we can help to validate some emails, but we'll come back to SPF in a little bit. Next slide, please. So being 6 months into COVID-19, it won't be news to tell you that it really has disrupted the way we're living and working day to day. It's also drastically altered the cybersecurity landscape for companies. Employees that were previously using desktop computers at their office, they might be at home doing work on personally owned devices that might be shared with family members or perhaps even roommates. And companies are having a hard time guaranteeing the security of those devices where they may not be controlling them. They might not be corporate-owned devices. In other cases, employees might be home using work devices, but might be doing so over non-secure networks. Another area that doesn't get much attention is the security of home routers, many of which are never patched or otherwise updated after the date of manufacture. Next slide, please. And a little bit more on the security of home networks. We do get a lot of questions about this. If you're leasing a cable modem from Verizon or Comcast, generally they update the software automatically as needed. So if they discover an issue with that hardware, they'll generally push out an update, and it's completely transparent to the home, to the user. But there are cases where you can purchase a cable modem. Maybe you don't want to lease and have that recurring cost. Amazon sells them, Best Buy sells them. Generally, your ISP will support them as long as that model is on their supported or compatible list. It's possible to have a device that they don't support, and they're not exactly upfront in telling you this, but you can use it at home. It's just that they're not going to update it when they see it on their network. So it's important to check whether what you're using at home is supported and is updated. Otherwise, it's completely up to you to keep that up to date and to see whether there are software or firmware updates for that device. And another area that I think we're seeing lots more of now is the Internet of Things, or what's called IoT. And these are things like connected thermostats, so Nest and Ecobee and those makers, smart speakers like your Google Home or your Amazon Echo, timers, refrigerators, microwaves. A lot of these devices now are Alexa enabled and so on. And even smart televisions. These are basically all computers that can be compromised just as any other computer can, and need to be kept up to date from a software and a hardware perspective. So just because it doesn't look like a laptop or a desktop doesn't mean it isn't really the same underneath, from a circuitry perspective. So something to keep in mind. Next slide, please.
Nick, can I add one thing on top
Of course.
of that, is to keep in mind that that IoT devices have passwords, and that the factory defaults for many of these devices are known. So when you have it installed, you try to change from the factory default to a real password, because otherwise it might be a target where somebody will say, hey, but they're aware from some type of social engineering that you have a particular device on site, and they can use the factory default and see if they can access your device. So if you can, have the passwords changed.
That's a great point. And that's another area where I think the brand name matters. When you buy these things, there's, if you go on Amazon or other e-commerce, eBay, other websites, a lot of these devices are being made by manufacturers that you probably never heard of. And, they're coming from overseas. There's no guarantee of their security and what issues that might be there, including built-in usernames and passwords that you can't change. And, if it's built into the device, chances are there's a list out there on the internet of all the default usernames and passwords for that particular device. And so if you can find it, hackers can find it. So I think this is one of those things where brand names matter. If you do want smart home functionality, IoT functionality, consider doing a little homework into the brand and go to websites like the Wirecutter or the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times have tech review sections, and do a little bit of homework before you go and purchase. Okay, so the most obvious change that we've seen, obviously, with COVID is that we're all working from home, and every organization from an infrastructure perspective is laid out differently, but many organizations are architected in such a way that the protections that, say, a firewall with maybe additional modules like intrusion detection or intrusion prevention are only protecting employees when they're physically in the office and plugged into the network. Employees at home may not be getting the benefit of those protections. So proximity is not just a factor for the protections you're getting in the office. It's also in a BEC attack scenario, not being next to your CFO or being down the hall from your CFO or the staff that is sending you this email is creating a problem. It's making it much more difficult to validate a BEC email. So if you get a request to wire $100,000 out the door, your CFO is not next door down the hall. He or she may be unavailable. They maybe, we're always all struggling with sort of childcare responsibilities. Maybe folks are working different hours now. It's just not as easy to validate these types of emails that we're getting in. So that's another major challenge that we're seeing. And of course, as we've mentioned, the theme here really is that COVID-19 is providing attackers with all sorts of subjects to try and phish people and try and hook them into a BEC attack scenario. And it's just a feeding frenzy. So we have to elevate our collective level of skepticism here. And then another troubling area, there's many these days, is that IT workers and IT managed service providers are being targeted deliberately for these types of attacks. Now, not all IT folks are trained on cybersecurity, and many are susceptible to the same attacks that hit non-IT folks. But in this case, of course, if an IT account is compromised, that account may have elevated privileges across the network. It might have the keys to the kingdom, so to speak, which would lead to much quicker organizational compromise, much more severe damage. This could go beyond a BEC attack. It could be a ransomware scenario or worse. So that's a troubling sign. So we need to start looking at our IT folks and consider that many don't have the cybersecurity background or training, and loop them into whatever organizational training programs we're doing. Another troubling sign too is that managed service providers, so outsourced IT providers, are being targeted. This is something that has predated COVID, but from an attacker's perspective, if they can compromise one outsourced IT provider, that's effectively a force multiplier that gives them inroads into all of the organizations that they're managing. So when doing business with an outsourced IT provider, you really want to get comfortable that they have the right protections in place and they're managing your network in a secure manner, and that they have the right tools in place that would protect them against an attack and alert them if an attack is underway. Next slide.
Hey, Nick, I was going to add one thing to that, which is keep in mind that same factor applies to pretty much any type of service organization. Law firms have the same concern that if they get hacked, you may get access to all their clients. The same would be true for accounting firms and other professional services firms. It's just, even if you're a small, it's one of the ones, even if you're a smaller entity, you may get targeted because you may have access to a whole range of other clients. And that would be an opportunity for the hackers. Okay, I guess I'll take the slide up here. We've done a lot of talking about the scope of the issue, some of the particular concerns. Now we're going to transition towards defense and what you can do to prevent it and stop it. As noted on the slide, the defense starts with having strong and compliant security agreements. I'm going to focus on two of them today. The first one is the Written Information Security Plan, or a WISP. Basic fact that people should know now, a decade into the Massachusetts rules, are that they're required of every company operating in Massachusetts. And there's a similar requirement in Rhode Island as well. I think they're the only two states in the country that do this, but since we're in Massachusetts, you're almost certainly subject to a WISP requirement. The foundation of a WISP is a risk assessment. You should take a look at the types of information you have in your business and take a look at what are the opportunities for somebody to access that type of information, the confidential information. And again, that's where the size of the business and complexity of the business will matter. If you're a hardware store with a website and a couple of credit card transactions and not much more than that, maybe some vendor contracts, you can size your WISP to address those particular risks. If you're a company like Mike's, TD Bank, with hundreds of branches, thousands of electronic transactions, wires to and from all over the world, you need to have somebody like Mike or a whole team dealing with it to deal with the risks of the business. Just keep in mind that you want to look at this, think about your risks, and get a good plan in place. Now, the Massachusetts rules are actually a really good roadmap for security requirements. It has some really nice things that that any company should be doing, even if the rules didn't apply. For example, you have to encrypt your outgoing emails to the extent that they include personally identifiable information or other types of confidential numbers or information. You have a vendor program. It's back to what Nick was just talking about. Looking at your outsourced IT providers. To the extent the outsourced IT folk have access to your personal information, you should be doing a due diligence on the vendors themselves to make sure they have reasonable protections in place, because you're the one who's going to be responsible if they're the ones who breach it. And then importantly, with any type of WISP, it needs to be regularly reviewed. You should be looking at it annually, if possible, or after you have a significant breach. You should be doing a check to make sure the plan and the processes reflected in the plan actually reflect current information. I've seen many clients of mine who develop a WISP and put it in the drawer for years, and it's outdated quickly, that's a bad thing. I had a plan I was looking at the other day where there was a big section on what are the security issues with dial-up modems. I think that's a pretty clear sign that the WISP is outdated. You really need to do the updating on that. And the other thing you should be doing is staff training. I think Mike has talked in this presentation quite a bit about that. Staff are the ones who make key decisions in this area and can make errors. Typically, the staff is the weakest link. You really should be training people on the key risks for your business. And to the extent you can reinforce it through phishing training or something else, that's great, but at least train people. The second security agreement we'll talk about is just an incident response plan. It is a plan that you develop, which kind of is a best practices action checklist in the event you have a potential information breach. It has a bunch of different elements in that, but generally that's what it is. It tells you have a situation, what are you supposed to do? Are you supposed to, you should have it will include a list of who are the key internal and external experts, so you can get them on the game as quickly as possible without delay. The best practices, for example, if you think that you've been hacked, you really want to have a computer forensics person on site as quickly as possible. They can take a picture of your network as it is, lock that up, and then before they can start fixing it, so they can really know what's happening with the system and they don't lose something in the process of fixing your computer system. And one critical thing of an IRP that really helps you is that it triggers a process so that you can proactively identify likely experts. You don't want to be in the middle of a crisis and say, oh my goodness, I don't have a breach lawyer on staff. We have to start interviewing people. You don't have time for that. You should know who your breach lawyer is going to be before you get into that situation. The same with your forensics computer person. The same with your security audit type people like Nick. You should also have your insurance broker, because in many cases you need to know what insurance coverages might apply and to be able to file timely claims. And in some cases, of course, there's also the PR, crisis management firm. Again, get them in quickly before you have problems happening. So that's an important one. So get your WISP. It's required by law in Massachusetts. Get it done. And for an IRP, it's a great thing to happen, because I had a client who had a breach recently and they had their computer forensics people on site, and their advice is, what I tell you to do is follow your incident response plan. That's what the advice was of the computer guys. So it's something to think of seriously for any company involved in this. Next slide.
Okay, it's time for our fourth and final poll question of the webinar. Do you have a WISP and/or incident response plan? I'm going to launch the poll right now. The possible answers are yes, both, WISP only, incident response plan only, neither, and I'm not sure. Give everyone a few minutes to get their information in. Once again, thank you to everyone for participating in this, giving us a clear picture of where the audience stands on some of these questions. Okay, and I'm going to close the poll in 3, 2, and 1. Looking at the responses, 33% said yes, both. 24% said I'm not sure. 19% said neither. 14% incident response plan only, and then 10% with WISP only.
Okay, just keep in mind for everyone, a WISP is required, so please get one as soon as you can. And I'm actually gratified that the incident response plan number is as high as it is. It is really something that every organization should have, but it's something that it's a lagging indicator. A lot of people don't. So I think it's something to think about. It's a good takeaway from this session that you should think about it. Thanks, Tom.
Great information. Thank you, Rob. So from a banking perspective, well, I think we can all agree there's no silver bullet to stop fraud. So your best approach is fighting back with a security layer approach. Excuse me. From the foundation, going from bottom up here, certainly network security is clearly critical to protecting business operations and preventing suspicious email traffic from getting into your inbox. Just as important, though, is the need to encrypt and protect sensitive data. And I think we all understand that while it's encrypted when you're sending out payments, it's just as critical to encrypt it at rest in your systems. Because again, if the fraudsters have access to your systems, they can easily come in and secure some of that confidential data and use that outside for fraudulent purposes. Segregation of duties is very important. You should develop policies and procedures around who in the company is allowed to do what in terms of issuing payments and or decisioning items. There should be a segregation of duties between the AP staff and or treasury or finance, again, depending on the size of your organization. There's also certainly the importance of multi-factor authentication, using tokens and passwords and other one-time use codes to manage your process of issuing payments. There's also the principle of least privilege, which basically says those staffers should only have access to tools and resources, to manage their roles, their responsibilities. They shouldn't have the keys to the kingdom. They should only have access to certain services and abilities. But at the top of the pyramid, it's still people. It comes down to people. It's still a human element issue. And it reminds me of an example of a couple of years ago from a client from another institution that experienced business email compromise, and in this case, ACH payment fraud. It involved a long-standing vendor relationship where they received a doctored invoice. Again, the invoice looked exactly like it normally does. It had the amounts they were looking for. The email looked good. There was nothing obvious about the transaction that would warn them this was a fraudulent item, except that after a month and a half, the supplier called and asked where were the payments. They went back and looked at the email, and in the email address, instead of abccompany.com, it said abccompany.corn, corn. The letters R and N in a lower font looked amazingly like the letter M. So again, it wasn't easily identifiable. Fortunately, though, in this case, the bank was able to refund most or recover most of the funds in this case because that account had been flagged and put a hold, and but even after that amount of time. So at least there was a good result in the end. So again, it comes down to the human element here. Just know that while day in and day out you're trying to do your job, fraudsters are trying to infiltrate your defenses day in and day out to create havoc and financial loss. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Mike. One of the more effective measures we can use to elevate the level of security around email is to implement what's called DMARC, domain-based message authentication, reporting, and conformance. And it incorporates two other standards. I mentioned SPF earlier. There's another technology called DKIM out there. DMARC wraps those both together. It's designed to fit into an organization's inbound message authentication process. Now, a lot of this is completely transparent to the average user, so I don't blame you if you don't know anything about your organization's inbound mail process, but your mail server is doing a lot of work behind the scenes just to process mail, and depending on the technology you're on, this type of authentication process can be built into that. And so basically what happens here is that as you receive an email, if the sender has DMARC enabled, they're basically publishing to the world the rules around which you should accept emails from their organization. So the mechanism here, basically it allows you as a receiving organization to validate those emails. It also protects senders as well. So if somebody's out there impersonating your organization and you publish these DMARC rules, you're giving the world some tools to help authenticate emails that may or may not be coming from your organization. So the example we saw earlier in the message headers, that message supposedly from the CEO of Techlicious that actually originated in the Czech Republic, that failed an SPF check because they published a rule that said, this is the address of our mailing server. If you're receiving emails from us that don't come from this address, something's not right. And so that's one of the main ways that we can help kind of add a layer of authentication to email. Next slide, please. Some other things we can do, of course, is blocking spoof domains. So dgccpa.co, which we know isn't our domain, there are tools for like major mail platforms like Google G Suite and Office 365 and so on that allow you to block obvious spoof attempts. I recommend doing that. Another thing we can do is mark emails with a warning banner that originate from outside our companies. So if you see that banner on an email from your CFO, that is obviously a red flag. We can, as one of our poll questions, we went back to targeted training, right? Talking about training for phishing attacks. And so, we saw 56% of you are not doing any type of training at all. I highly recommend that because phishing is the primary avenue, and it has been for quite some time, into organizations that could result in a BEC scenario, could result in a ransomware scenario, could result in a data breach type scenario. Phishing is the primary vector by which hackers are getting into organizations. So if we can conduct targeted simulated phishing exercises, and basically these are situations where you might sign up for a service or bring in a vendor that is going to send your company, your employees, what look like phishing emails, and they could be all levels of difficulty, but they're going to be sending your staff the same type of emails that hackers would. And if you have employees who are what I like to call serial clickers, who will literally click on everything that comes in front of them, this is a good way to identify those people before a hacker does and enroll them into additional training and basically level up their skepticism and give them the tools they need to identify suspicious emails. So, Rob mentioned that, this can be a bit of a sensitive topic from a cultural perspective. I think we want to, across the board, we want to encourage environments where people are not afraid to make mistakes when it comes to security and be a little transparent about our own blind spots and weaknesses. And so from a corporate leadership perspective, engaging in this, guarantee you senior executives will be clicking on things they shouldn't. It's very common, but we want to encourage that, sort of a collective sharing of vulnerabilities, so to speak, and acknowledgement that we all have blind spots when it comes to security, and protecting against phishing attacks is one of the most important things you can do. So training is a key component of that. Another area is limiting what's posted on social media, what you or your executive team are posting on social media. One of the, and this is, we tend to see this with bigger organizations, one of the ways that hackers are coordinating the timing of these attacks is around the schedules of the executives they're looking to impersonate. So if you've got an executive that is going to the Caribbean on vacation and has sort of been open sharing that, or maybe they're going on a speaking tour or something like that where it's all shared, the hacker is probably more apt to time the email around the time of the flight to the Caribbean or soon before that executive is speaking. So consider, in certain cases, you won't be able to do anything about that, but that's an opportunity to sort of level up the skepticism. If you receive any emails from this person moments before going on a plane or being on before a speaking event, think twice about that. And of course, using best-in-class antivirus and anti-malware technologies. I just say, best in class for your size, small, medium, large. There are absolutely best-in-class solutions out there that won't break the bank. And consider the the reputation and the quality of what you invest in. Next slide, please.
And I know we can't reiterate this enough, but it's not enough to just have robust technology and the appropriate fraud prevention processes. It still comes down to having the risk management being embraced from the top down with regular training from employees encouraged and the latest resources available to all employees. CFOs need to ensure that their organizations stay abreast of latest threats with clear understanding of how to spot and avoid them. But more importantly, they also need to build a culture in which fraud awareness really becomes second nature for the whole team. And again, we note several times in this presentation, it shouldn't be a one-time exercise. It should be a regular occurrence, as we talked about through training and or fake phishing attempts, and to keep everyone honest and compliant with company or employer policy. Again, the Treasury and finance staff should be well educated to identify different scams that could be coming and classified as external fraud as well as internal fraud, which again, according to the stats last year with the FBI, almost half of the dollars lost in financial loss cases came or were classified as internal fraud. Next slide, please. From a banking standpoint, another recommendation we have would be to see if your systems can create detection rules or add it to your operating system. Again, for the purposes of, with exception rules or examples of a first payment to a new or modified bank account, a payment that isn't consistent with the history to that vendor, payments to maybe a country where there is no known supplier, and or changes to a payment that was imported directly from your ERP system. Who changed that payment? Was it verified? Again, we suggest if it's able to be done on your operating system to create proactive alerts and a real-time scanning of these payments, and also to have the ability to implement a full separation of duties for the escalation and or resolution of any detected payments. So again, as we note here, the most important consideration for CFOs is to complement the traditional payment controls with real-time screening of payments against some detection rules that you can put in place. We see this combination can offer CFOs a better defense against internal and external payment fraud. Next slide, please. So what we see here, again, from the banking perspective, and providing here 10 common risk management practices. I won't go through each of these, but as we mentioned a few times already, cultivating a risk management culture within the organization from top down, I think is a paramount concern. Mandate process controls. Every payment should really be a dual control or dual authorization process, and there should be a segregation of duties. In some cases, it might make sense to isolate a computer, avoid public Wi-Fi for banking and payment initiation, also for deposit purposes, but also pick up the phone to authenticate all payment requests, both internal and external. Don't depend on any information provided in an email if you think it's remotely suspicious. Just pick up the phone and make a call to a contact you know at that vendor, or obviously for an internal colleague. Inspect your bank accounts, obviously, reconcile them frequently. If you're online every day, that's the best way to manage this. You can also structure your bank accounts to isolate certain activities and leverage the control. Certainly from a banking perspective, we recommend you use any and all available fraud deterrent services, such as Positive Pay for check print, ACH blocks and filters for ACH activity. And there are also some automated receivables and payables solutions that can validate banking information in case, again, you're concerned it may be suspicious. You certainly want to monitor your company information through credit reporting agencies and state records, again, because someone could be trying to create identity theft if you're not paying attention and acting as your company outside. You certainly want to initiate background checks on all contractors, vendors, and even employees where necessary. And last but not least, you absolutely need to notify the bank and law enforcement immediately if you're under any type of phishing or BEC attack. Okay. Tom, I'll turn it over to you. As I understand I'm sorry, responding to an incident. Don't forget questions.
Thanks, Mike. So we've spoken. I know we're getting a bit short on time here, but we'll move through this one and then we'll move to questions. So we've spoken about what business email compromise is. We've spoken about the technical ways that you can get impacted. What if you are hit? What should you do? Rob spoke earlier about the importance of having an incident response plan, and I want to expand on the value of that and how it can be a benefit to you in the event that you are the victim of a BEC attack. So it's critical that you have this capability and that you call upon it to act quickly and decisively. If the BEC attack was a result of account compromise, the attackers might still be active in your network. They might be looking to compromise additional accounts or further entrench themselves. So your incident response team should have the resources, the capability, and the authority to investigate the incident and act to contain it as quickly as possible. And timing might also be a factor in your ability to reclaim any money that had been wired out. So that's something to consider as well. And lastly, one of the primary goals of your incident response exercise should be to identify the root cause, figure out how it happened, and move forward with a lessons learned mindset. So ideally closing whatever mechanism it was that that was resulted in the compromise in the first place. So look to prevent that from happening again. Next slide.
In terms of a breach, I'm not going to go through the incident response piece. I think we've covered that one enough. So some of that's up on the slide. I'd like to focus more on what's a reportable breach. It is something where you need to make the call on, is there some confidential data that's legally protected that was accessed? And that typically is personally identifiable information combined with a name. So it's PII, which is both a name and a confidential number. There's also separate categories for, say, healthcare information, some other ones. Now, it's either going to be the data is a breach if it's unprotected or unencrypted, or if it's encrypted and the code is up for the encryption is also accessed. Once you have a reportable breach, typically you have to file disclosure information to state officials. Usually, like in Massachusetts, is with the state consumer agency and the attorney general. Other states have different agencies, but similar. And then often you have to disclose to the individuals. It's a very regulated process. You're supposed to say certain things and not say certain things, and you need to get it right. And that's something you should have reached counsel to help you with that. The other piece of it is that sometimes you have other things you have to include and show. Like in some cases, you have to provide credit monitoring for affected individuals as a matter of law. You have to do it. That's the case for Massachusetts if this is a social security number breach. I think it's also true in Connecticut as well. And then there's also all sorts of other ancillary things you should be thinking of if you're in that type of breach mode with individual information, such as sometimes you need to make available an 800 number so that people can answer questions, call up and get answers. Sometimes you need to explain to them, give them the contact information for the credit check services like Equifax and Transamerica, so they can do credit freezes and the like. Again, something you have to do. Keep in mind the clock is running once you have the breach. Typically, they're going to want to have you file your notices in a reasonable time, which is typically a month or a bit more than a month. So don't let it drag on too more. You're going to get into legal trouble on that. The other thing is that increasingly we're seeing a lot of breaches that are not reportable. For example, if a hacker accesses a customer username and password information, or in some cases, like the financial transfer, wire fraud stuff, they don't really get the stuff that legally qualifies to be disclosed. Just because it's not a technical breach doesn't mean it's not important. If its customers have password information out there, then you really need to think seriously about letting your customers know what's happening so that and recommend that they change their passwords. You also may want to offer goodies like credit monitoring to people as well as a customer relations issue. So keep that piece of it in mind. The important thing is you want to make sure that the customers are not going to be harmed and subject to future theft that arises from the root cause of where you are on that.
All right, I just want to jump in here. I know we're right at our time now at 2 o'clock. I just want to let everyone know that there are some helpful resources as well that'll be available in the slide deck. You will get the slide deck in an email from GoToWebinar. It'll also be available at dgccpa.com. And for those of you who did ask questions, I know we're out of time. We will respond to you offline. We really appreciate you being here today and taking the time to meet with us. So on behalf of DGC, TD Bank, and Davis Mom, thanks again for joining us. The slide deck and a recording of the presentation will be on dgccpa.com later today. And of course, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to reach out to one of our panelists. Their contact info is on the screen. For Nick, Mike, and Rob, my name is Tom Medino. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you for joining us.